Good morning and welcome to the second of three videos on the heart and blood vessels, which is chapter 5 in your textbooks. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the flow of blood through the body. In the last video, we talked about the anatomy of the heart and the blood vessels. And now we're going to talk about the actual circulation of the blood through the heart and the blood vessels. Now, generally speaking, and hopefully you'll remember from the last video that the heart is a double pump. All right, if you look carefully, whoopsie daisy, you can see that there are two halves of the heart. And the right side of the heart is taking in deoxygenated blood through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava into the right atrium. The blood then passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle and then out through the pulmonary artery here, this way, up and to the lungs. Now, one thing that I do want to point out that that you should be aware of is that this diagram only shows the pulmonary artery going into the right lung and then coming back from the left lung, and that's not really true. There is a branch of the pulmonary artery that goes to each of the two lungs, all right? So they literally, the lungs function separately. And so that represents what we call the pulmonary circuit, all right? It's the right side of the heart bringing blood from the body to the heart and then sending it to the lungs, okay? Now, on the other hand, the second circuit is the systemic circuit, and this is governed by the left side of the heart, and it's bringing blood from the lungs back to the left side of the heart. So here you can see the blood flowing into the left atrium, but remember that there's also a branch of the pulmonary vein coming from each lung, okay? And so from here, we pass through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then eventually out and to the various parts of the body. Now, this represents four major regions: the head and the arms on the top, the digestive system down here, the urinary system here, and then the trunk and the legs down here. All right, so if you go back to the first video and the four major stops on the cardiovascular subway, if you will, we had the lungs here, the digestive system, the urinary system, and then the body cells. All right, and all of those are represented in this diagram. All right, and so the pulmonary circuit governs the heart, takes blood in from the body and sends it to the lungs. The systemic circuit takes blood from the lungs and sends it out to the heart. Now, one of the things that you should notice in this diagram is the thickness of the walls of the heart. And I should have pointed this out in the last video. But notice here you've got a very thin layer of muscle, whereas on the left side you have a much thicker layer of muscle. Now think, why might that be? Well, your heart is located right here in your chest, and your lungs are located literally right next to it, okay? And so the right side of the heart doesn't really have a lot of work to do. It doesn't have it nearly as much as the left side, because the left side of the heart is taking that blood from the lungs and pumping it to everywhere else in the body. And so you would expect, and obviously it is true, that the left side of the heart has a much thicker layer of cardiac muscle in order to get that job done. The last thing that I want to point out, and this is something that we're going to talk about in more detail in the third video, but look at this little section right here between the small intestine and the liver. This is what's known as the hepatic portal vein, and it is a unique blood vessel in the body because it starts in a capillary bed in the small intestine, ends in a capillary bed in the liver, but there's no pump in between. The heart doesn't play any role there, which is a very unique scenario in the body. Okay, Now, this is a Bozeman science video of Paul Anderson talking about the circulatory system. Obviously, you can't watch it by clicking on this video, but I have uploaded the PowerPoint that I'm using here to the Canvas system. So you can open up that PowerPoint and watch the YouTube video of Mr. Anderson. Again, he does a much better job at the illustrations and that sort of thing than I do. So I highly recommend that you watch it. Okay, so let's talk about the beating of the heart. Okay, there are two phases to a heartbeat. All right, the systole and the diastole. During systole, the atria contract, right, and they contract at the same time. So the left atrium and the right atrium are contracting together, and then the two ventricles contract together. All right, so the top of the heart beats first, or contracts first, and then the bottom of the heart does. After systole, we have diastole, which is the resting phase. So the systole is the working phase, and the diastole is the resting phase. And during this point, the chambers relax and begin to fill back up with blood. During the contraction, they're squeezing blood out of their chambers. The sound, as I said in the last video, is produced by the closing of the atrioventricular valves as well as the semilunar valves. So the first part of that heartbeat noise is this closing of the atrioventricular valves, and then the second part of the heartbeat, the sound, is the closing of the semilunar valves. Now, your heart beats approximately 70 times per minute, so every 8/10, 9/10 of a second or so. And the cardiac cycle itself is controlled by the nervous system. All right, it's automatic, it's involuntary, but it is controlled by signals from your brain through two nodes of nerve cells that are found attached to the heart. All right, the heartbeat itself is controlled by a portion of the brain called the medulla oblongata, which controls pretty much all of the involuntary aspects of your heartbeat and body. Now, blood pressure. All right, you've probably all had your blood pressure measured at some point in a doctor's visit, or if you've ever given blood or that sort of thing. And your blood pressure is essentially the pressure against a blood vessel wall. Typically, it's measured in an artery in your arm, although you can measure it in any artery that's close enough to the skin that you can essentially squeeze. And so there are two numbers associated with a blood pressure reading. And the highest number is the pressure as the heart is pushing blood out, all right, out from the ventricles, all right. This is called the systolic pressure. The lowest number, the lower number, is the diastolic pressure, and this is when the ventricles are relaxing. Now, it's measured essentially by squeezing, and you can see the cuff here. The technician, physician, nurse, whoever it is, essentially squeezes the artery in the arm so much. Come on now. So much that the artery is held closed, and no matter how hard the heart pushes, it can't open the artery. And so notice the stethoscope here. All right, what the doctor here is listening for is the sound of the artery opening and closing. All right. Well, at the systolic number, or above the systolic number, I should say, there's no sound at all. So they pump it up to 150 to 200 millimeters of mercury, and then they slowly release the pressure. And where they first hear a sound of the artery literally opening and closing, opening and closing, all right, that's the number that they read as the systolic number, the higher number. All right, and so the sounds heard are of the artery opening and closing. All right. They continue then to release the pressure in the cuff, and eventually the artery opens and stays open. And when that first happens, they no longer hear any more noise because the artery is staying open. It's not collapsing anymore. And that number is the diastolic number. Now, your average blood pressure for a young adult your age is approximately 120 over 80. All right, the 120 is the systolic number, the 80 is the diastolic number. Okay. All right. Now, in terms of blood flow, all right, there's a couple of things that you should realize. Now, first, the blood flow is obviously under the highest pressure in the arteries because they're narrower and they have more muscles because of those thick muscular walls. Blood flow is very slow in the capillaries because you have to slow them down so that diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and wastes can actually occur. All right, there has to be time for diffusion to actually occur. The blood pressure tends to be very low in your veins, but the volume of blood and therefore the blood flow increases. So if you follow the path here from the arteries through the arterioles, through the capillaries, to the venules, and eventually to the veins, and then follow the chart here, blood pressure is going up and down and up and down and up and down in the arteries. It diminishes throughout the arterioles, and then the blood pressure is itself very low in the capillaries and remains low through the venules and veins. The speed of blood moving through the cardiovascular system is very high in the arteries, diminishes in the arterioles, sinks down to a very low velocity in the capillaries, and then does pick up a little bit in the venules and veins. Last but not least, the amount of volume in the vessels tends to be very low in the arteries, very high in the capillaries, and again, it goes back down to a low volume in the veins. So what that means is that at any given moment, most of your blood is actually found in the capillaries. Think about that, right? We said yesterday, or in the last video, that we had 6,300 square meters of capillaries in our systems, all right, surface area anyway. And so we would expect to find the greatest volume of blood there. Okay, now, your blood pressure, as we said in the last slide, is very low in your veins. So how come the blood flow actually increases? Well, there's a little bit of pressure there, which keeps the blood flowing, from the capillaries back up to the heart. But there's a little bit of help. Anytime your skeletal muscles contract, what they do is literally they squeeze the veins, and that pushes the blood. All right. Now, there are valves that close that prevent the backflow of blood. See, the valve is closed in this scenario. So when let's say these are the muscles in your calf. Excuse me. And so you're walking. When those muscles contract, they push the blood in your legs back up toward your heart. And when the muscles relax, the valves close, and that prevents the blood from going back down. And so it's a very efficient system of moving blood through your body. Now, blood flow problems are one of the reasons why they say if you're taking a long flight or if you're sitting a long, long time for whatever reason, that you should get up every once in a while and walk around, because that does increase your blood flow. Because when the muscles contract, by breathing, by walking, by flexing your muscles, whatever it is, that helps to move blood through the body, and again, makes the whole process much more efficient. Okay, so the last video was quite long. This video is actually much shorter, and so this is where we'll end the second of the 3 videos on Chapter 5. And I hope you learned something.